right? And by the time you're 24, 34, 44, you're pretty much well on that way, right? So one risk factor of addiction, and let me go through them quickly. Number one, genetics, then environment. Are kids growing up in a neighborhood or a home where everyone's using drugs or dealing drugs or drinking, then they think that's what everyone does, right? It's Tuesday, it's sunny, it's snowing, it's Ravens football, that's just what you do. Another risk factor, mental health and, mental health, depression and anxiety. Depression and anxiety are the number one reasons people go to counseling. But you have somebody who has a problem with depression, they're going to be 4.6 times more likely to be an alcoholic. Right? Now, there's plenty of people in the world who have depression and they have anxiety, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be alcoholics and drug addicts. I will say that there's still exists a big split between the drug and alcohol addiction community and therapists and mental health therapists. Some people think, well, Johnny has depression. We need to get to the bottom of why he's smoking weed all the time. Maybe it's the depression. And if we cure the depression, Johnny's going to stop smoking weed, or Johnny will stop, smoking crack, or whatever the case may be. And that's all well and good, but any counseling for teenagers that are using drugs must include urinalysis. End of story, period. And maybe the place doesn't give urinalysis tests. Maybe that's not part of that therapist repertoire. Then go out to the Rite Aid or Walgreens and buy an over-the-counter urinalysis. You can do that. They're not always the most accurate, but they can give you like a base level. Probably the number one thing that you can do if you really want to keep your kids sober is give them surprise drug tests, right? And tie consequences to how that test comes out, right? And kind of hit them where it hurts. Cell phone, internet, right? I heard somebody say once, and this is just, I think, good for parents in general, once you find out the internet's crack and you're the crack dealer, right, you can have a lot of impact over the kids. That's kind of a story for another time. But, I think it's important for, oh gosh, there goes my ADHD. What was I just talking about? Oh, I was talking about, the split between mental health and drug and alcohol. I've known kids who have been in therapy for years, for depression and anxiety, not one drug test. Now, kids aren't stupid. Therapists are going to be like, or anyone are going to be like, do you use drugs and alcohol? They're going to say, drugs are bad. They're like, oh, whew, let's get to the real meat of your issue. They might be wasted, like right in your session. Or by the time that anyone notices they have a drug and alcohol problem, they might be they might be much sicker, right? And certainly when I was an adolescent counselor, I saw that a great deal. So it's important to coordinate. It's also important to realize that kids lie. Substance abusers lie, right? And it's not personal. That's just what they do because they love it. And they're going to do whatever they need to do in order to get whatever they want. So back to risk factors. Another risk factor aside from mental health are negative life experiences, abuse, right? Sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. These are huge issues, right? And as a clinician, sometimes I would see different sorts of adolescent use that would make you wonder if they had an underlying, pretty severe abuse history. Instead of having the kid that, I drank for the first time in 9th grade and then I slowly worked up, sometimes you'll see kids very young use and they are complete, what I call garbage heads. They will use anything that they can get their hands on. Anything to not feel. Like they don't discriminate, just anything. And it's like that substance use is on them like a blanket. That, at least for me as a clinician, makes me wonder what's going on. That kid so young wants to feel absolutely nothing. Now, I will also say, as a longtime counselor, if you have someone who's an addict or an alcoholic with, let's say, a sexual abuse history, that person cannot safely address their sexual abuse history with 6 seconds of sobriety because probably the drug and alcohol use is keeping them from shooting themselves in the head, just to be very, very blunt. So, if other clinicians are like, you've been sober for a week and a half, let's get down to that hardcore abuse, because that just stresses them out And it's a long journey, from recovery from stuff, but you don't want to put them at risk by making them talk about the most difficult stuff in their life. So back to risk factors. Early age of onset. Starting to use before age 15, you're way more likely to be an alcoholic. And what I used to say to my clients was, let's take somebody who starts using at, say, 11 or 12 versus somebody who starts at 16 or 17. What do you know at 11 or 12? I don't know. How not to get stuffed in the locker at school, how to buy ice cream at lunch, right? Generally, it's thought the age at which you start using is when you stop kind of maturing, right? So if you get sober, having those sort of ice cream, not getting stuffed in my locker skills might not be the best ones to go back to. And so, back to my issue of should I let my kids smoke weed in the house because I'll supervise them, it's important to give kids' brains a chance to mature, right? Even if, it might be inevitable, right? Like, I know my kid's going to have, such and such problem. Buy them time. They have a much better prognosis if they start using at 16 or 17, if you can get that, than 11 or 12 or 13, right? Because they have more time to develop skills. They have more time for their brain to develop. And I think most people can understand intuitively somebody who starts at 11, 12, 13 is going to be worse off than somebody who starts as a later teenager. Other issue with risk factors, kids with ADHD, kids who are learning disabled, right? Sometimes people say, I don't want to put my kid on a stimulant because that's going to make them a drug addict. Actually, research shows that kids who are not properly diagnosed for ADD, ADHD, learning disabilities are more at risk, right? Because what happens to the little boy who can't sit still, who can't stop talking, who is running around all the time, right? Especially once they get to elementary school. They're getting in trouble. She starts thinking they're bad, right? Or they can't pay attention, or the kid who's dyslexic and nobody picks up on it, right? Eventually kids, particularly by the time they get to middle school, are going to say, you think I'm bad? I'll show you bad, right? And it's painful to always be in trouble. And so it is, well, the other thing about addiction and understand about ADHD, and this certainly, I'm going to make a sweeping kind of generalization, is that the issue with ADHD is there's a part in your prefrontal cortex, which is actually behind your frontal lobe, that goes too slow. And because it goes too slow, you have trouble focusing and paying attention, and your brain goes too fast. It's kind of like mine. But us Gen Xers didn't have really Ritalin or anything like that back then, so you just sort of learn to cope. But they can't sit still because that part of their brain goes too slow. So if you give them a stimulant, it speeds up that part of their brain so they chill out, right? Now, you give even an ADHD kid too much of a stimulant, and they're going to be chewing the buttons off their shirt, right? Because it is a stimulant. And you do have to be careful if you have other comorbidities like autism and things like that, because they're going to be really sensitive to medication, more sensitive than other kids. But it is important to pay attention if kids are having trouble. You're not going to have a 7th grade boy that's had learning disabilities that nobody's ever picked up be in math class and say, I don't get it. He's just not going to do that because it's not cool. He doesn't want people to think he's stupid. So he might shut down in some way. And I don't know. I think that is just a super brief overview of, I could talk for hours about all of this kind of stuff. But just to quickly recap, know what runs in your family. What kind of example are you setting? And have you spoken with your spouse or significant other or whomever you live with? What are we going to do if we find the bong in Junior's room? Right? Are we going to leave it there? No, don't do that. Right? Are we going to leave his weed because it belongs to him? No. And last point, go in their rooms. Know what they're doing online. It's very difficult to know what kids are doing online, especially because everyone's online right now. But do your best to know what's going on online. The basic stuff. How do I know if my kid's using? Have you found stuff? Are they radically different? Right? Do you see changes in their mood, in their appearance? Are their friends changing? Do you not know any of their friends? Are you hearing things from their friends? Because I think it's a much bigger deal if friends of your kids start saying things, dropping hints, right? And actually, the last thing I'll say is know what's in your house. Know what's in your medicine cabinet. If you have narcotics, if you have opiates, that old Percocet, script from your knee surgery 10 years ago, get rid of it. Because kids that develop problems with opiates, with pills, are 40 times more likely to become heroin addicts. 40 times. What's the path between weed and heroin? Pills. So if you got them in your house, you need to get rid of them or you need to lock them up. And that is absolutely no joke. And you need to realize that if your kid is old enough to have other kids in the house, those kids, if they have drug and alcohol problems, are going to be going through your medicine cabinets and taking your stuff. Or if there's a grandparent that they visit and, grandpa's had, cancer or something like that and he has pain pills around, you need to lock that down because a kid with a substance abuse issue is going to take all that kind of stuff. So I'm actually going to be quiet with all that being said. And
we have some questions. So what are some tips you can give parents in order to take care of themselves?
So what is Al-Anon? Okay, so Al-Anon is sort of a partner program to Alcoholics Anonymous. And Alcoholics Anonymous was developed in 1935, a support group that basically all the other support groups grew out of. The Baltimore Intergroup Office for Alcoholics Anonymous, I'll give you the phone number, 410-663-1922. You could always call the Alcoholics Anonymous office to even ask about Al-Anon. There are people that man those phones, but there's also a Baltimore Intergroup for AA, just online. Just Google Baltimore AA. Al-Anon is the companion program. That's like for the spouses or, the adult children. There's all sorts of stuff that is online. There's adult children of alcoholics, ACOAs. There's there's ACAs, which is another thing. There's Alateen. Everything's gone online. And even though some people say they don't like online, the internet allows people who maybe don't have access, who can't get out of their house, to try to find other people who are also going through the same stuff. I think it's important if you have a child or if you have an adult in your life who's an alcoholic or a drug addict, you have to get support for yourself because they're so manipulative. Like I say, they rush you, they scare you, they pull at your heartstrings, right? You need to find other people who are going through the same stuff because trust me, you are not the only one. It feels like you're the only one because in this society, if we have kids, for example, that have drug and alcohol problems, everybody blames the parents. Didn't you tell them drugs are bad? Right? Meanwhile, every song, every movie, every Hollywood person is it's not great examples necessarily out there.